silver tray crashed across the ballroom floor, just as Miss Honoria Vale lifted her trembling hand from her stomach, and every noble guest turned when her fiancé laughed loud enough for the musicians to stop playing. 3 years promised to me, he declared before the entire hall, and not even a whisper of an air. The room fell silent beneath the candlelight. Honoria stood frozen, while whispers spread from one corner of the estate to the other. Some pitied her. Others enjoyed the humiliation far too much. But the cruelest part was the way her fiancé stepped aside, as though she had already become a disgrace he wished to abandon. Then the doors opened. Duke Benedict Norwin entered the hall with rain still clinging to his coat, his sharp gaze settling on Honoria before anyone could speak again. Nobody missed the way the Duke looked at her. Not her shattered fiancé. Not the widowed countess watching from the staircase. Not the Duke's own mother, whose face tightened the moment Honoria lowered her eyes, and certainly not the servants who would later swear that the future of House Norwin changed at that very moment. Because the Duke did not offer her pity, he offered her his hand. Now tell me honestly, if a man publicly shames the woman he promised to protect, do you believe he deserves another chance when regret finally comes knocking at his door? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me which beautiful part of the world you're watching from tonight. And if you enjoy Grand Duke romances filled with betrayal, longing, and revenge that tastes sweeter with every chapter, subscribe now, because this story is only beginning, and I will absolutely be reading your replies. The ballroom of Ashvale Manor had seen many scandals in its long life, but none quite like this one. Honoria Vale stood at the center of it all, with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, and her breath coming in slow, careful draws, because she had decided long before tonight that she would not give these people her tears. She had given Lord Prentice Galford 3 years of quiet devotion, 3 years of waiting patiently through his moods and his delays and his endless excuses about timing, and she had done it all without complaint, because her mother had raised her to believe that a good woman endured. But endurance had a limit, and Honoria had just found hers. The silver tray lay scattered at the foot of the marble steps, and the sound of it still rang faintly in the silence that had swallowed the room. The musicians had lowered their instruments one by one, and 300 guests stood frozen beneath the blaze of the chandeliers, all of them watching, all of them waiting to see what Honoria would do next. Prentice had not moved from the spot where he made his declaration. He stood with his chin lifted and his arms folded, wearing the expression of a man who believed he had just done something noble instead of something unforgivable. Beside him stood his cousin, Mr. Aldous Fenn, who had the grace to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot and studying the floor as though he wished it would open beneath him. Honoria looked at Prentice for a long moment. She looked at the way his mouth curved with something between contempt and relief, as though he had been waiting for an excuse to do this for a very long time and was grateful the evening had finally provided one. She looked at the people around her, the ladies behind their fans, the gentlemen exchanging weighted glances, the young debutantes near the far wall who watched with wide eyes and parted lips. Then she looked at her mother. Mrs. Agatha Vale stood near the refreshment table with her hand pressed flat against her chest, and her face the color of cold ash. She was a small woman who had fought hard battles to keep her daughters in respectable society after their father's early death, and every one of those battles was written in the tightness around her eyes tonight. She caught Honoria's gaze and gave the smallest, most desperate shake of her head, a silent plea that said, "Do not make this worse." Honoria understood. She straightened her shoulders and said nothing. It was then that the main doors opened. The rain came in first, a cold gust that made the candles nearest the entrance shudder and lean. Then came the sound of boots on marble, steady and unhurried. And then came Duke Benedict Norwin himself, still wearing his travelling coat with the damp of the evening clinging to it, as though he had ridden hard to arrive and had not stopped to consider appearances. He was taller than Honoria remembered from the one occasion she had seen him across a crowded assembly room 2 seasons ago. His jaw was sharper, his expression more closed, and he moved through the parted crowd with the particular ease of a man who had never once doubted his right to be in any room he entered. His dark eyes swept the ballroom in a single pass and found Honoria immediately, as though she were the only fixed point in a room full of spinning things. He did not look at Prentice. He did not acknowledge the scattered tray or the frozen musicians or the whispering guests. He walked directly to where Honoria stood, stopped at a correct and proper distance, and offered her his hand with the quiet authority of someone who had already decided how this evening would end. "Miss Vale," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "I believe you promised me the next dance before I left for the country. I apologize for my delay." The silence in the room changed quality entirely. Honoria stared at his hand. She had made no such promise. She had never spoken more than 6 words to this man in her life. But his eyes held hers steadily, and there was something in them that was not pity and not performance. It was an offer, a door held open by someone who had no obligation to hold it. She took his hand. The musicians, reading the room with the professional instinct of people whose livelihood depended on such readings, lifted their instruments and began to play. Prentice Galford's face did something complicated and ugly. His cousin Aldous touched his arm and said something low and urgent near his ear. But Prentice shook him off. The widowed Countess Darvel, who had been watching from the staircase with sharp, calculating eyes since the scene began, descended 2 steps and stopped, her gaze moving between Benedict and Honoria, with an expression that Honoria could not yet read. The Duke's mother, Lady Constance Norwin, stood near the east wall beside 2 of her closest companions, and her face had gone very still in the way that very composed people's faces went still when they were working hard not to show what they were thinking. She watched her son lead Honoria Vale onto the floor, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and she did not look away. Honoria felt all of it. Every eye in the room, every whisper beginning to form behind gloved hands, every calculation happening in real time about what this meant and what it signaled, and whether the Duke of Norwin had lost his senses or simply decided to make a point. She felt her own pulse loud in her ears, and the strange, weightless sensation of having stepped off a ledge she had not known she was standing on. "You did not have to do that," she said, quietly, once they were moving and the music covered their words. "No," Benedict said simply. He did not elaborate. "They will talk." They were already talking. She almost laughed, which surprised her entirely, because there was nothing funny about this evening, and yet something in his directness struck her as almost absurd in the best possible way. She pressed the feeling down and kept her expression composed. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Because what he did was a disgrace, and because you did not deserve to stand in it alone." Honoria said nothing. She was not certain she trusted her voice just then. They finished the dance in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had said enough for one evening, and both knew it. When the music ended, Benedict returned her to her mother with a formal bow and left without seeking further conversation. Honoria watched him cross the room toward a group of men near the tall windows, and she noticed the way the group shifted to receive him, the way Prentice Galford, standing 20 feet away, tracked his movement with something hot and wounded behind his eyes. Her mother gripped her arm immediately. "What was that?" Agatha whispered. "I am not entirely certain," Honoria said honestly. Across the room, Lady Constance Norwin finally moved, stepping away from the east wall and making her way toward her son, with purpose in every step. The morning after the ball at Ashvale Manor arrived grey and damp, and Honoria sat in the small parlour of her family's rented townhouse with a cup of tea she had not drunk and a letter she had not opened. The letter bore the Norwin seal. Her younger sister, Miss Beatrice Vale, sat across from her, with her needlework abandoned in her lap, and her full attention fixed on Honoria, with the barely contained intensity of someone who had been waiting since dawn to ask questions and was running low on patience. "It has been sitting there for 20 minutes, Beatrice said. "I am aware of how long it has been sitting there." "Are you going to open it?" "I am considering it." Beatrice set down her needlework entirely. She was 4 years younger than Honoria, with their mother's quick eyes and their father's stubborn jaw, and she had a talent for cutting directly to the heart of any situation that Honoria found both useful and exhausting, depending on the hour. "Honoria, he danced with you in front of everyone after Prentice made that terrible scene. The entire city will have heard about it by breakfast. Whatever is in that letter matters." Honoria knew she was right. She broke the seal. The letter was brief. It was written in a firm, even hand, and it contained no flourishes and no sentiment. It requested the honour of a formal call that afternoon, if Miss Vale was agreeable, and it was signed simply, Benedict Norwin. Honoria read it twice. Then she folded it and set it on the table. "Well," Beatrice demanded, "he is coming this afternoon." Beatrice made a sound that was not quite a word, and picked up her needlework again with the energy of someone who needed to do something with her hands. Their mother arrived in the parlour 10 minutes later, with Mrs. Holt, their housekeeper, trailing behind her carrying a stack of linen that nobody had asked for, but that Agatha Vale apparently felt was necessary to reorganize immediately. Agatha read the letter standing up, handed it back without a word, and then spent the next hour directing a cleaning of the parlour that the parlour had not requested and did not need. Honoria retreated to the window and watched the street. She was not a woman who had ever imagined herself connected to a man like Benedict Norwin. She had been raised practically, not romantically. Her father had been a respected but modest landowner whose estate had passed to a distant cousin upon his death, leaving his wife and 2 daughters comfortably but not extravagantly provided for. Honoria had understood from a young age that her future would depend on a sensible match, not a grand one, and she had made her peace with that understanding long before Prentice Galford had appeared, and seemed, for a time, to be exactly the sensible match she had prepared herself for. She had not loved Prentice. She had respected him, or believed she did, which she now understood was a different thing entirely. She had trusted that his steadiness meant reliability, and that his practicality meant fairness, and last night had shown her how thoroughly she had mistaken a man's surface for his character. The carriage arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. Benedict Norwin descended from it with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything, and Honoria watched him from the window for the 3 seconds it took him to cross the pavement before she made herself step back. He was shown into the parlour by Mrs. Holt, who managed to look both extremely professional and extremely curious at the same time. Agatha Vale was already seated and perfectly composed, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression arranged into the pleasant neutrality of a woman who had survived too much to be rattled by a duke in her sitting room, even if the rigid set of her spine said otherwise. Beatrice had been firmly instructed to remain upstairs. She had agreed with such immediate cheerfulness that Honoria fully expected to find her crouched near the top of the staircase later. Benedict greeted Mrs. Vale with correct formality and took the offered seat. A tray was brought, tea was poured, the expected pleasantries were exchanged, and then Benedict set down his cup, looked at Honoria directly, and said what he had come to say. "I will not pretend that my reasons for coming here are conventional," he began, "because they are not, and I think you are a woman who would see through pretense immediately regardless." Honoria held his gaze. "Go on. I have need of a duchess. That is not a secret to anyone in London who pays attention to such matters. My estate requires an heir, my mother requires the reassurance of a settled succession, and my position requires a woman of character and composure at its side." He paused. "What happened last night was not how I intended to introduce this conversation, but I watched how you stood in that room, and I made a decision." Agatha Vale had stopped breathing in any visible way. Honoria said carefully, "You are proposing a marriage arrangement based on one dance and an evening's observation. I am proposing a marriage arrangement based on 3 years of your conduct in society, which I have had ample opportunity to observe through mutual acquaintance and public record, and yes, one evening in which your character was tested severely and did not crack." The room was very quiet. "There is something you should know," Honoria said, and she felt the familiar weight of the words before she spoke them, the weight she had carried since the physician's careful, apologetic voice had delivered the verdict 2 winters ago. What Lord Galford said last night was not simply cruelty. The physicians he consulted gave him a report. I was told myself, some time ago, that the likelihood of my bearing children is considered very low. I do not say impossible, but low. If your purpose is an heir, I may not be able to give you one, and you should know that plainly before you continue." She watched his face. She was very good at watching faces now, after years of learning to read rooms quickly and quietly. Benedict Norwin did not flinch. He did not rearrange his expression into sympathy, which she would have found insulting. He simply looked at her for a moment with steady attention, and then he said, "Physicians have been wrong before. They have also been right. Yes, they have." He was quiet for a beat, then added, "I am not a man who builds his decisions on certainties that do not exist yet. If children come, they will be welcomed. If they do not come for a time, there are other paths. What I cannot accept is a household without a woman at its center who has both the strength and the sense to hold it together. That is what I came here to say." Agatha Vale made a small, controlled sound that was not quite a word. Honoria looked down at her hands for a moment. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about Prentice's voice carrying across the silence, and the way some of those guests had smiled. She thought about what her life would look like if she declined this offer and returned to the careful, diminished existence of a woman whom society had publicly marked. She thought about Beatrice, who needed a season and a future, and a sister whose standing could open doors. She looked up. "I will need time to think," she said. "Not long, but some." Benedict nodded once. "Of course." He rose, thanked her mother for the tea, and took his leave with the same quiet economy with which he had arrived. The front door had barely closed before Beatrice appeared at the top of the stairs, entirely too quickly for someone who had been anywhere other than exactly where Honoria suspected. "I heard everything," Beatrice announced without apology. "I know," Honoria said. "He is remarkable," Beatrice said, "and terrifying, but mostly remarkable." Agatha Vale finally exhaled fully for what appeared to be the first time in an hour. She looked at her elder daughter with eyes that held a great deal of feeling and very few words, which was the language the two of them had always spoken most fluently when things were serious. Honoria sat down on the parlour settee and stared at the empty teacup in front of her. Outside, the grey morning had not lifted. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of carriage wheels fading, and Honoria sat very still in the middle of the life she had always known, standing at the exact edge of the one she had never expected. Honoria gave her answer on the third day. She sent no elaborate letter and made no ceremony of it. She walked into the small study where her mother sat reviewing household accounts, placed Benedict Norwyn's letter on the desk, and said, "Tell him yes." Agatha Vale looked up from the columns of numbers and searched her daughter's face for a long moment. Whatever she found there made her nod once, slowly, and reach for her pen. The engagement was announced quietly at first, the way careful things are announced when the people involved understand that the world is watching and waiting for a crack to appear. But London society does not do anything quietly for long, and within 4 days the news had spread through every drawing room and dining table in the city, with the speed and enthusiasm of something people had decided was either deeply romantic or deeply suspicious, depending on who was doing the deciding. Prentice Galford was deciding loudly. Honoria heard about it first, from Beatrice, who had it from a friend, who had it from her own mother, who had been seated directly behind Prentice at a card evening 2 nights after the announcement. He had apparently told 3 separate people that Honoria had engineered the entire ballroom scene to attract the Duke's attention, that her humiliation had been performance rather than genuine suffering, and that Benedict Norwyn was walking into a marriage with a calculating woman who had deceived him from the beginning. "He is frightened," Beatrice said, with the calm clarity she applied to most unpleasant truths. Men like Prentice attack when they are frightened. "He is doing damage," Honoria corrected, because she was practical enough to separate the emotional cause from the practical effect. The damage was real. She saw it in the way Lady Frome, who had been warm toward her for 2 seasons, suddenly found reasons to be occupied whenever Honoria entered a room. She saw it in the careful distance that certain mothers of eligible daughters began to keep, as though association with Honoria might somehow contaminate their own prospects. She saw it in the small, sharp smiles of women who had always found her composure slightly irritating, and were now enjoying watching it tested. What she did not expect was Lady Constance Norwyn. Benedict's mother called on her 6 days after the engagement announcement, arriving at the townhouse with her companion, Miss Dorinda Platt, and the particular energy of a woman who had dressed deliberately for a conversation she intended to win. She was elegant and cool and perfectly mannered, and she sat in Agatha Vale's freshly arranged parlour and looked at Honoria the way a magistrate looks at evidence. "I will be direct," Lady Constance said, after the tea had been poured and the pleasantries had been completed with mechanical efficiency. "My son has made his decision, and I will not insult either of us by pretending I have the power to unmake it. What I will say is this. I am a woman who has spent 30 years protecting the Norwyn name, and I will not stop doing so simply because Benedict has chosen a wife." "I would not expect you to," Honoria said. "There are people speaking against you. I am aware. Lord Galford in particular is being very thorough." Lady Constance set down her teacup with a precise click. "He visited my home yesterday morning, The room temperature seemed to drop slightly. Honoria kept her expression level. "He brought a letter," Lady Constance continued. "He claims it was written by the physician who examined you 2 winters ago. It outlines his findings in considerable detail, and it ends with a statement that the physician himself considered your condition permanent, rather than uncertain." Honoria felt the familiar cold weight settle in her chest, but she did not look away. "And what did you do with the letter?" "I read it." Lady Constance's eyes were steady and unreadable. "And then I told Lord Galford that I would need time to consider its contents, and I showed him out." She paused. "I am telling you this because I believe you deserve to know what is being used against you. I am not yet telling you what I intend to do about it." Agatha Vale, seated beside her daughter, had gone very still. Honoria said, "The physician's letter, if genuine, says nothing that I haven't already told your son myself. I disclosed everything to him before I gave my answer. He made his decision, knowing the full truth." Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in Lady Constance's expression. It was not warmth exactly, but it was the nearest thing to respect that her face seemed capable of producing in a first meeting. "You told him?" "Yes." "Before the engagement?" "Yes." A silence settled over the room. Miss Dorinda Platt, who had been sitting quietly with her own tea and the studied invisibility of a long-time companion, glanced at Lady Constance with an expression that suggested this answer had changed something in her assessment as well. Lady Constance rose. "Then I have nothing further to say today." She smoothed her gloves with great composure. "I will, however, say this. Lord Galford is not finished. Whatever he brought to my door, he will take to other doors. Prepare yourself accordingly." She left with Miss Platt at her heels, and the parlour felt 3 sizes larger in her absence. Honoria looked at her mother. "She is not an enemy," Agatha said carefully. "She is not yet a friend either," Honoria replied. "But she told me. That matters." 3 days later, Prentice Galford's campaign found a new and more effective instrument. Her name was Mrs. Lavinia Croft, a widow of moderate means and immoderate ambition, who had positioned herself as one of society's most reliable sources of useful information, which was a polite way of saying that she traded in other people's misfortunes with the enthusiasm and efficiency of a merchant who had found a particularly profitable commodity. Mrs. Croft appeared at a Tuesday afternoon gathering hosted by Lady Frome, where Honoria had accepted an invitation specifically because she understood that retreating from society now would be read as confirmation of everything Prentice was saying. She arrived to find Mrs. Croft already installed near the window, with a small audience around her, and a story already in progress. The story concerned a letter. Not the physician's letter, but a different one. A letter that Mrs. Croft claimed had been written by Honoria herself, to a gentleman whose name she declined to provide, but described with enough specific detail that the assembled company could do their own arithmetic. The letter, according to Mrs. Croft, proved that Honoria had been conducting a private correspondence of an intimate nature during her engagement to Lord Galford, and that her broken engagement was therefore not a matter of his cruelty, but of her own faithlessness. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms get quiet when something damaging has been said, and everyone is waiting to see if it will stick. Honoria walked directly to the center of that quiet. "Mrs. Croft," she said, with a steadiness that cost her considerably more than it appeared to, "I would be very interested to see this letter. If it bears my handwriting, my signature, and my seal, I will have nothing to say in my defense. If it does not, I imagine you will want to reconsider the source who gave it to you before your own credibility becomes part of this conversation. Mrs. Croft blinked. The small audience shifted. "I do not have it with me," Mrs. Croft said, and her confidence had developed a hairline fracture. "Then I suggest you produce it before you repeat the story," Honoria said, "because I intend to ask my solicitor about the legal weight of a false accusation made in a public company, and I would prefer not to involve you in that inquiry, if it can be avoided." She stayed for the remainder of the gathering and spoke to 6 people and ate a small piece of cake and left at a perfectly normal hour. She sat in the carriage on the way home and pressed her hands flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. Benedict came to her 2 days later. Not formally, not with advance notice, but directly, arriving at the townhouse in the early afternoon, while Honoria was in the back garden, attempting to do something useful with her restlessness by reorganizing the herb beds that their housekeeper Mrs. Holt had given up on 3 seasons ago. He stood at the garden gate for a moment before she noticed him. She looked up from a particularly stubborn root and found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately catalogue, something between concern and something quieter that she did not examine too closely. "You should have told me about Mrs. Croft," he said. "I handled it." "I know, I heard." He came through the gate and stood near the low stone wall at the garden's edge. "That is why I am here." Honoria set down her gloves and gave him her full attention. "Prentice has been to see 2 of the men on my estate board," Benedict said, and his voice was level, but there was something beneath the levelness that had an edge to it. "He is suggesting that I have made a reckless decision under emotional impulse, and he is proposing that the board consider whether a formal inquiry into the estate's succession planning might be appropriate given the circumstances." Honoria stared at him. "He is trying to use your own people against you." "He is trying," Benedict said. "He will not succeed. But I want you to understand the full shape of what we are dealing with, because it is larger than drawing-room gossip now." She absorbed this quietly. Then she said, "Why does he want this so badly? He ended the engagement. He made that speech in front of 300 people. He is the one who walked away. Why does destroying me matter so much to him now?" Benedict was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression he was deciding how much to tell her. Then he said, "Because you are marrying me, instead of disappearing. He expected you to be ruined and removed from the picture entirely. A ruined woman with diminished prospects would confirm the story he told himself about why he ended things. A woman who becomes the Duchess of Norwin makes him look like a fool who discarded something he did not understand the value of." The clarity of it settled over Honoria like cold water. "He is not trying to protect himself from me. He is trying to protect his own version of the story." "Yes." She looked at the herb beds for a moment, thinking. Then she looked back at Benedict. "What do you need from me?" He seemed slightly surprised by the question, as though he had expected something else, protest or distress, or a request for reassurance. "Steadiness," he said, after a brief pause. "What you have already been showing is exactly what is needed. Every time you handle one of these situations with composure, it costs him credibility and builds yours." "And the estate board?" "Leave the estate board to me." There was a firmness in those 5 words that Honoria found she believed entirely. She nodded. He stayed in the garden for another 10 minutes, and they talked about unremarkable things: the weather, the state of the herb beds, a book Beatrice had apparently sent him a very earnest note about after Honoria had mentioned it offhandedly in passing. It was a strange and oddly comfortable 10 minutes, and when he left, Honoria stood in the garden for a while after the gate had closed and tried to understand what it meant that ordinary conversation with this man felt more like solid ground than 3 years of careful engagement to Prentice Galford ever had. The threat that arrived the following morning was less subtle than anything that had come before. It was not a letter. It was a message delivered verbally by a young man Honoria did not recognize, who appeared at the townhouse door and asked for Miss Vale, and told the startled Mrs. Holt to pass along a single sentence. Lord Galford wishes Miss Vale to know that there are other physicians willing to testify, and that a broken engagement can become a broken reputation with very little effort if the current course is not reconsidered. Mrs. Holt delivered the message word for word, with a face like thunder and both hands gripping the hem of her apron. Honoria wrote it down, every word exactly as delivered. She dated it, folded it, and put it in the small locked box in her writing desk, where she had been placing every piece of this situation since it began. Then she wrote a note to Benedict and sent it within the hour. His reply came before evening. 4 words. I have it handled. What handled meant became clear 2 days later, when the young man who had delivered the threat was identified as a clerk in the employ of a solicitor named Mr. Gideon Call, who had recently taken on Lord Prentice Galford as a client for what was described in certain legal circles as a consultation regarding estate and matrimonial disputes. Mr. Call received a visit that afternoon from Benedict's own solicitor, a formidably quiet man named Mr. Alderton Price, who was known in legal circles for the precision of his correspondence and the devastating completeness of his documentation. Nobody repeated the specifics of that meeting, but the verbal threat stopped. What did not stop was Mrs. Lavinia Croft, who had apparently decided that her credibility was already invested in this particular narrative and committed herself to seeing it through. She appeared at Lady Darvill's Thursday salon, where Honoria had also been invited, and this time she came with what she described to the assembled company as direct testimony from a former housemaid of the Vale family, a girl named Tess, who claimed to have witnessed correspondence being passed between Honoria and an unnamed gentleman through the kitchen entrance on multiple occasions. The assembled company leaned forward collectively. Honoria looked across the room at Tess, who was standing near the door looking young and frightened and deeply uncomfortable, as though she had agreed to something and was only now understanding the full weight of what she had agreed to. Honoria did not address the company. She walked directly to Tess. "How long did you work for my family?" she asked, quietly enough that only Tess could hear her clearly. 2 years, miss," Tess whispered. Her eyes were bright with something that looked very close to shame. "Did anyone pass correspondence through our kitchen entrance during those 2 years?" Tess swallowed. "No, miss." "Did someone offer you money to say otherwise?" A long pause. Tess's chin trembled. "Yes, miss." Honoria straightened and turned to face the room with complete calm. "Mrs. Croft," she said, at a volume that carried cleanly, "I believe your witness would like to correct her statement." The room was absolutely silent. Mrs. Croft looked at Tess. Tess looked at the floor, and the silence stretched long enough that every person present understood exactly what it meant, without anyone having to say another word. Honoria left the salon with her head level and her hands still, and the locked box in her writing desk growing heavier by the day, with evidence she hoped very much she would never need, but which she intended to keep building regardless. Because Prentice Galford had taught her one thing, if nothing else: a woman who documents everything is a woman who cannot easily be erased. The wedding was set for the 3rd week of October. Honoria learned this not from Benedict directly, but from Lady Constance, who arrived at the townhouse on a Tuesday morning with a list, a seamstress, and the particular energy of a woman who had decided that if this marriage was happening regardless of her initial reservations, it would at least happen correctly. The list was extensive. It covered the guest arrangement, the ceremony order, the breakfast menu, and 3 separate considerations regarding floral presentation that Honoria suspected had been drafted over several evenings with great personal investment. Lady Constance went through each item with the focused efficiency of a general reviewing troop positions, and Honoria listened and responded and asked sensible questions, and somewhere in the middle of the 3rd page, something between them shifted almost without announcement. It was a small thing. Honoria suggested a change to the ceremony seating that would place Benedict's elderly great-aunt, Lady Prudence Norwin, closer to the front without disrupting the formal arrangement, because she had noticed at a recent dinner that the old woman's hearing was not what it had been, and that she grew quietly distressed when she could not follow conversations around her. Lady Constance stopped mid-sentence when Honoria made the suggestion and looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for exactly 3 seconds before composure returned. "You noticed that," Lady Constance said. It was not quite a question. "I pay attention to people," Honoria said simply. Lady Constance looked at her list for a moment. Then she made the adjustment without further comment and moved to the next item. But something in the air of the room had changed, and Miss Dorinda Platt, who was sitting quietly in the corner as she always did, caught Honoria's eye briefly and gave the smallest possible nod of acknowledgement. Prentice made his final move on the Friday before the wedding. It was, in its way, the most dangerous thing he had attempted, because it was the most public and the most direct, and it came at the moment when Honoria was least positioned to absorb another blow without visible effect. He appeared at the church, not during the ceremony, which had not yet occurred, but at the small pre-ceremony gathering that Benedict's family held at Norwin House the evening before, a tradition of long standing in the Norwin family that was nominally private, but inevitably attended by enough people to constitute a significant audience. Prentice arrived in the company of a man Honoria did not recognize, a heavy-set gentleman with a physician's bag and the expression of someone who had been paid to be confident. He requested, loudly and in the hearing of at least 30 people, that the gathering pause to consider a medical testimony regarding the fitness of the proposed union. The room went very still. Benedict was across the hall when it happened, in conversation with his estate manager, Mr. Rufus Hale, and 2 of the board members whose confidence Prentice had attempted to undermine weeks earlier. He heard the commotion and came through the connecting doorway with the kind of controlled speed that looked like a walk, but covered ground very quickly. Honoria was already standing in the center of the room. She had learned, over these past weeks, that the worst thing she could do was wait for someone else to manage the moment. She had learned that composure under pressure was not the same as passivity, and that there was a particular kind of power in speaking first and speaking clearly before the room had time to decide what it was witnessing. "Lord Galford," she said, and her voice carried across the entire hall without effort. "You have tried letters, solicitors, paid witnesses, and verbal threats. And now you have come to my future husband's home the evening before our wedding with a hired physician and a final attempt." She let that settle for exactly 1 breath. "I want everyone in this room to take a moment and consider what kind of man does this, not what kind of woman I am. What kind of man does this?" The silence was the most complete she had ever heard indoors. Prentice's face went through several colors. The physician with the bag looked at his employer with an expression that suggested he was rapidly revising his understanding of the situation he had agreed to participate in. Benedict reached Honoria's side and stood, there without speaking, which was more powerful than anything he could have said, because his presence beside her and his silence were both a statement and a verdict delivered simultaneously. It was Lady Constance who spoke next, and she spoke from the far end of the room in a voice that had been sharpened by 30 years of protecting something she loved. "Lord Galford," she said, with a quiet devastation that was far more effective than volume, "you are in my home. You are not invited to my home, and I will ask you once, politely, to leave it." Prentice left. The physician left slightly ahead of him, which, under different circumstances, might have been amusing. The gathering resumed. Benedict's great-aunt, Lady Prudence, who had been seated near the fire and had apparently followed every word with perfect clarity, despite her usual difficulties, announced to the woman beside her that she had always found Lord Galford to have an unfortunate chin, and that this had now been confirmed as meaningful. Benedict found Honoria near the window 20 minutes later, when the room had returned to something resembling its normal temperature, and 3 separate conversations were happening loudly enough to provide cover. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it in a way she would not have been able to mean it 6 weeks ago. He was quiet for a moment, standing beside her and looking out at the dark garden beyond the glass. Then he said, "You did not need me to handle that." "No," she agreed, "but I was glad you came to stand there anyway." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was not a declaration and not a question, but was perhaps the beginning of an answer to something neither of them had yet found the exact words for. Outside, the October night pressed cold and clear against the windows, and somewhere in the house a clock began to strike the hour, and Honoria stood in the warm light of Norwin House and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that the ground beneath her feet was entirely solid. They were married on a Saturday morning, when the October light came sideways through the church windows and turned everything inside the colour of warm honey. Honoria wore a gown that Lady Constance's seamstress had spent 3 weeks constructing, full and voluminous in the proper Cinderella manner, with layers that moved when she walked, and a train that required Beatrice and a second attendant to manage with great concentration and suppressed excitement. Beatrice had cried getting ready and denied it strenuously, and then cried again in the carriage and blamed the cold air, and Honoria had held her hand and said nothing because some things did not need words. Agatha Vale walked her daughter to the church door and stopped there, because the tradition required it, and looked at Honoria for a long moment with eyes that held everything their family had been through and everything she hoped this moment meant. She straightened Honoria's glove with one precise, careful movement, and then stepped back. Honoria walked in alone, which was the tradition, and which she found she didn't mind, because she had been walking into difficult rooms alone for months now, and had learned that she was more than capable of it. Benedict was waiting at the altar with his back straight and his hands clasped in front of him, and when he turned and saw her, something happened to his expression that he did not immediately school back into composure, which was the first time Honoria had seen him fail to do that, and which she found she would remember for a very long time. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Thaddeus Moorby, a round and genuinely kind man who had christened Benedict 34 years ago, and who performed the service with the warmth of someone who found great satisfaction in completing a circle he had begun long ago. He stumbled slightly over one passage and corrected himself with complete cheerfulness, and nobody minded at all. Lady Prudence Norwin wept from her front row seat with absolute freedom and no apparent embarrassment, and Benedict's cousin, Mr. Harwick Norwin, who was 22 and had clearly decided the occasion required personal significance, stared at the ceiling at one point with the rigid composure of someone fighting their own feelings unsuccessfully. The register was signed, the church bells rang, and Honoria walked back down the aisle as the Duchess of Norwin, with her hand on her husband's arm and the October light pouring through every window like something deliberate. The weeks that followed were not simple, because nothing real ever is. There was the adjustment of learning a household the size of which Honoria had never managed, with a staff of 41 people across the main house and the adjacent buildings, each of whom had their own established rhythms and their own quiet assessments of the new Duchess and what her arrival meant for the order of things. Honoria approached this the way she approached everything, by paying attention first and speaking second, by learning names before issuing direction, by asking Mrs. Peel, the head housekeeper, the kind of specific and genuinely curious questions that told a woman of Mrs. Peel's experience that the person asking actually wanted to know the answers. Mrs. Peel had served 3 generations of Norwins and had an opinion about everything and shared it with almost nobody. Within 3 weeks, she was sharing it with Honoria, which Benedict noted with quiet satisfaction, and Lady Constance noted with something that was increasingly difficult to distinguish from approval. There was also the matter of Lady Constance herself, who did not transform overnight into warmth, but who revealed herself, in gradual and specific ways, to be a woman whose initial reservations had never been personal cruelty, but genuine fear for her son and the line she had spent her life protecting. She arrived for dinner one evening in the 2nd month with a small, flat package wrapped in tissue and set it beside Honoria's place at the table without ceremony. Inside was a miniature portrait of Benedict, at approximately 7 years old, round-faced and serious-eyed, and wearing an expression of profound concentration over something held out of the frame. He was looking at a beetle, Lady Constance said, when Honoria looked up. He was fascinated by beetles that summer. I was told it would pass. It did not pass for nearly 2 years. Honoria looked at the miniature, and then at the woman across the table, and understood that this was not a small gift at all. "Thank you," she said. "You are managing him well," Lady Constance said, which was, Honoria had learned, approximately the highest form of praise the woman possessed. Benedict, who had heard this from his seat at the head of the table, looked at the ceiling briefly with an expression that suggested he had a great deal to say about being managed, and was choosing, wisely, to say none of it. Beatrice came to stay for the winter season and brought her brightness and her opinions and her completely unmanageable enthusiasm for the library at Norwin House, which was 3 times the size of anything she had previously encountered, and which she treated with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. She and Lady Prudence Norwin discovered a shared passion for a particular series of botanical illustrations, and could be found on multiple afternoons in the east sitting room, with volumes spread across every available surface, arguing companionably about the accuracy of certain leaf renderings. It was during this period, quiet and full and almost domestic, in a way Honoria had not expected to find so deeply sustaining, that the physician came. Not Prentice's hired man, but Dr. Edmund Farley, the quiet and thorough physician whom Benedict had engaged on the recommendation of a colleague after the wedding, and who had been conducting his own careful assessment over several weeks with the patient attention of someone who didn't believe in rushing conclusions. He came on a grey November morning and spoke to Honoria first, and then to Benedict, and then to them together, and what he said was not a guarantee, because he was too honest a man to offer guarantees where none existed. But what he said was that the original assessment had been made quickly and under conditions he considered less than thorough, and that he found no evidence of the permanent condition that had been stated with such confidence, and that with time and with patience he considered the matter considerably more open than it had previously been described. Honoria sat very still when he finished speaking. Benedict thanked Dr. Farley and walked him out, and came back and sat across from his wife in the small sitting room where they had received the physician, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Honoria said, "He said with time." "He said with time," Benedict agreed. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the physician 2 winters ago, and his careful, apologetic voice, and the way she had carried his verdict like a stone in her chest through every day that followed it. She thought about Prentice using that verdict as a weapon in a ballroom. She thought about the nights in the first weeks of her marriage, when she had lain awake wondering whether she would eventually fail even this, even here, even now, when everything else had finally turned toward something good. She looked up and found Benedict watching her with an expression that was open in a way she had only seen from him in unguarded moments, quiet and direct, and without the reserve he wore in the world beyond this room. "Whatever happens," he said, "this is already real. You understand that." She did understand it. She had understood it for some time, if she was honest, from the garden conversation and the window at the pre-ceremony gathering, and the way he had come to stand beside her when Prentice made his final move, not to rescue her but simply to be there, which had always been the thing that mattered. "Yes," she said. "I understand that." The following spring, Honoria planted a proper herb garden at Norwin House, because the existing one had been neglected for years, and because she found she thought most clearly when her hands were occupied with growing things. Mrs. Peel provided opinions. Beatrice provided enthusiasm and remarkably little practical help. Lady Prudence provided a 40-year-old notebook of planting observations that turned out to be genuinely invaluable. Benedict watched from the garden wall on a Saturday afternoon in April, with his coat off and his arms folded, and an expression of complete contentment that he would have denied entirely if asked to describe it. Honoria looked up from a particularly resistant patch of soil and caught him watching and said nothing, because she had learned by now that some things between them lived most fully in the space before words. That autumn, the announcement went out from Norwin House. It was brief and formal, and written in Benedict's firm, even hand, and it informed the relevant parties that the Duke and Duchess of Norwin were expecting their first child in the spring. Lady Constance received the news in her sitting room and sat quietly with it for a long time before she allowed anyone to see her face. Lady Prudence announced that she had known from the beetle portrait that things would turn out correctly, and that she expected everyone to agree with her. Beatrice cried immediately, and did not bother to blame the cold air this time. Agatha Vale held her daughter's hands in both of hers, and said nothing for a full minute, and then said everything, and said it only once, and Honoria heard every word. And somewhere across the city, in a life that had grown smaller and quieter since October of the previous year, Prentice Galford read the announcement in the morning paper and set it down and looked at the window for a long time. The story that he had told about Honoria Vale, the story of a barren woman who had nothing to offer and nowhere to go, had ended, and the story that had replaced it was one in which he appeared only briefly, as a man who had held something extraordinary and mistaken it for nothing. Honoria did not think about him often. She had too much to tend to, a house and a staff and a husband and a sister and an old woman with a beetle portrait and a notebook full of planting observations and a spring child coming and a herb garden that required consistent attention if it was going to be what she intended it to be. She had too much that was real and present and growing to spend time looking backward at something that had already finished. This is the kind of story that makes you think, isn't it? So here is what I want to know. When Honoria stood in that room and turned the question back on Prentice instead of defending herself, was that the moment she truly won? Or was it the moment Benedict stood beside her and said nothing, and that silence said everything? Drop your answer in the comments below. I am reading every single one, and I will be responding to you directly. And tell me which part of the world you are watching from tonight, because this community stretches further than you know, and I love seeing where these stories land. If this one moved something in you, please subscribe so you are here when the next chapter of a new story begins. You do not want to miss what is coming.